Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, Muslim, non-Muslim, and everyone in between. In this video, inshallah, we are going to be talking about what Allah is by contemplating on some of the descriptions that have been given in the Quran regarding the nature of Allah. We have come to understand that the name Allah is most likely the combination of two words, Al and Ilah, which later on came to be fused to make up the name Allah for simplicity due to the evolution of languages over time. But we won't be focusing on this aspect of the topic. Rather, we will be going through the Quran itself and try and correlate the attributes of Allah to what we understand about the universe. When it comes to the attributes of Allah, we can break them down into three separate categories. Those attributes which are core to Allah, meaning that they describe the nature of Allah. Those attributes which describe the role of Allah, meaning they describe what Allah functions as. And finally, those attributes which describe what Allah does. We may notice that some of the attributes may overlap in some instances. Before we get started with the different attributes, perhaps it would behoove us to spend a few seconds on what the term Ilah means. The term Ilah, translated as God, simply means force, and it is correlated to the Hebrew term for God, Elah or El. It was used to refer to the supreme force that governed all other forces in the universe. Some have suggested that the reason why the name Elah or El is pluralized in the Bible to Elohim is because it denotes the supreme force above all other forces. Hence why some scholars have suggested that among the ancient Hebrews there was a recognition of other forces besides El, but that El was the supreme force of all forces and that only He was worthy of worship. For more information on this issue, please check out Dr. James Tabro's channel, or perhaps you can purchase his translation of the book of Genesis. So if we wanted to provide a raw definition of the term Al-Ilah, that would be the supreme force. However, due to simplicity, we will stick to the term God as we proceed throughout this video. Perhaps the first chapter that we can use to figure out what Allah is would be chapter number 112, Surah Al-Ikhlas, which reads as follows: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. The English rendition of which is, say He is God, the uniquely indivisible and irreducible, the indestructible, unaffectable source of refuge. He does not reproduce, nor was He produced, and there cannot be anyone as equal to Him. So in this chapter, we are given a core definition of what Allah is, namely that Allah is that which is indivisibly unique, Ahad, which is the indestructible refuge, Samad, and that which does not beget nor was it begotten, Lam Yalid wa Lam Yulad, and that to which there cannot be an equal, Walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Now, if we were to break down the first description, we would come to the conclusion that God is that which is indivisibly unique, Ahad, which means that God cannot be divided or separated into different parts, which makes it unique compared to anything else. It is the only entity or phenomenon which cannot be subdivided into parts. Furthermore, we are also told that God is the refuge which is indestructible, meaning a Samad, thereby complementing the previous verse of God being indivisible, Ahad. The word used for this description in this verse is a Samad, as I said, which appears only once in the Quran, and it refers to something which is firm, solid, indestructible, unchangeable, unaffected, and appealed to for refuge. All these connotations are implied in the term as-Samad, which makes it even the more special since it only occurs once in the entire Quran. So to sum up the first 2 verses of this chapter, God is that which is indivisibly unique, indestructible, firm, solid, unchangeable, unaffected, and the source of refuge for every single thing. We are then informed in the following verse that God is that which does not reproduce, typically rendered as He does not beget, lam yalid. We are also told that walam yulad, meaning nor was He produced, typically also rendered as nor was He begotten. This means that God is not a biological organism, since biological organisms reproduce either through sexual or asexual reproduction. Lastly, we are told that no one is or can be unequal to God. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ, meaning that there is nothing that can be elevated to the level or significance of God, inferring that God is the only significant being or entity in existence, al-haq, and nothing can be raised to the level of its significance. We will expand on this as we continue on in this video, but to sum up the chapter as a whole, God is that which is uniquely indivisible and irreducible, the indestructible and unaffectable source of refuge for everything, which does not reproduce nor was it produced, and to which nothing can be unequal or equated. The next couple of verses that we will be looking at, which also provide us with information about the nature of God, are found in chapter 57 verse 3, which reads as follows: هو الأول والآخر والظاهر والباطن وهو بكل شيء عليم. And the English rendition of which is, He is the Alpha and the Omega, and the evident and the immanent, and He is of all things knowing. In this verse, we are told that God is that which is the Alpha, meaning the first or the initial, al-awwal, implying that God is the source of everything, that from which everything began, and also that God is that which is the Omega, al-akhir, meaning the last or the finality, implying that the culmination of everything is God. This is in contrast to the popular statement that Muslims say when someone passes away, found in chapter 2, verse 156, which reads, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. The English rendition of which is, Verily to God do we belong, and to Him are we to return. This statement implies that from God did we originate before our initiation into the world, and to God shall we return. Similarly, God as the finality of everything is furthermore stressed in chapter 55, verse 26 and 27, which read as follows: كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام. The English rendition of which is, Everyone upon it will perish, whereas the countenance of thy Lord will remain, the possessor of grandeur and honor. So, as can be seen in these verses as well, God is that which is the finality of everything and everyone upon the earth. Furthermore, in verse 3 of chapter 57, we are also told that God is the evident and the immanent, al-zahiru wal-batin, meaning that God is that which is apparent and perceptible, but yet intrinsically unapparent. Now, one may raise an objection here and claim that there is a contradiction. However, there is actually no contradiction in this statement at all. How can God be that which is apparent and unapparent at the same time, or perceivable but yet imperceivable at the same time? According to the Quran, though God can evidently be perceived, the human faculty that can perceive Him is not through the human eyesight, which most of the time is what people appeal to when they require a so-called proof of God. Mostly they want something which they can perceive with their eyesight, whereas God says in chapter 6 verse 103, لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار وهو اللطيف الخبير. The English rendition of which is, sight cannot capture a glimpse of him, whereas he glimpses all sight, though he is the subtle, the acquainted. So according to this verse, God is that which sight, here in particular human sight, cannot glimpse or perceive, whereas it, i.e. God, can perceive all sight. However, its perception is both subtle and aware. It is so subtle that we don't even realize it, nor even fathom the possibility in our minds. Some people imagine in their minds the impossibility of something being in constant watch over us, that it leads them to reject the entire concept of God, not knowing that that is what God is. God is imperceptible, but yet perceptible at the same time. So how can we then perceive of God? God is perceived through the actions and movements that occur within the entire universe. Anything that moves, breathes, talks, or thinks does so through the will of God, meaning that the force behind the action that you do is done due to that something which we call God, the operating force behind everything in existence. To put it in simpler terms, God is that without which the existence of everything else cannot exist. Meaning that when you do even the most mundane act that you can think of, you only do so because there is a force that permits and enables you to carry out that act, and that force we call God. You cannot perceive of the force behind the act with your eyesight, but you know that it is there, meaning that it is both apparent in the fact that you know it is there, but yet unapparent in that you cannot perceive of it with your eyesight. What you can perceive is the mere action, and from that you can suppose the existence of a force, and likewise with every action in the universe. Call it energy, call it power, call it force, it really doesn't matter. There is something which inescapably enables you to do what you do. And not only does it enable you, but it also restricts you. Now there are some other attributes which we can explore about the core nature of God, but we do not have the time to go through all of them. So let us explore some other attributes which might not necessarily be core to the nature of God, meaning those attributes which describe the role of God, such as the attributes Al-Malik, meaning the king, or Al-Khaliq, meaning the creator, and many such attributes. The attribute Al-Malik, or the king, describes something which necessitates the presence of the concept of a king, meaning that unless the term king exists in the human vocabulary, it does not exist for God. What this means is that since human beings are the ones who invented the concept of kings, we cannot attribute this role to God prior to the invention of it in the human vocabulary. So prior to human beings inventing kings, God would not have been referred to as a king, since human beings could not have understood what kings are. So if, for example, human beings referred to their higher figures as leaders, then God would be referred to as the leader, implying that he leads everybody and everything. This is equivalent to the name Al-Hadi, the guide. Similarly, if they had a ruler called a manager or a governor, then God would be referred to as the manager or the governor, similar to Al-Aziz. So to God is attributed the roles that humans invented as they advanced throughout human history. But if we were to go back to the very first human beings, we would find that they will refer to God with simplistic terms, such as the Great Spirit, or the Great Power, or the Great Force, as we see in several African natural religions and amongst other indigenous peoples. God amongst these peoples is referred to with simplistic terms, and in some with maybe one single term or phrase, which in of itself is not a name but rather a role, such as the maker, implying the one who made everything. That could be equivalent to al-ja'il, because Allah made everything. It was only later in human history, as human beings became more and more sophisticated, that they too began referring to God with a variety of names, and amongst some with even specific personal names, such as Yahweh, Ra, Zeus, Odin. This is because human beings are a naming species. So it was simply a matter of time before they attributed a personal name for God. Whereas in essence, there is no such thing as a personal name of God. And if there was such a name, it would certainly not be able to be vocalized in any human language. If God had a personal name, then he would have to have given it to himself at some point in time. He could not have always existed with that name, since human language was not present. It would be foolish for someone to assert that God spoke Arabic or Hebrew or any human language before he created. So the idea of God having a personal name really isn't worth delving into, as it limits God to a specific human language. And far beyond is God above all that. God is the God of everybody and not of a specific people. So if he had a personal name, it would not be specific to a certain people. And here I am particularly referring to the beholders of the biblical scripture who claim that the personal name of God is Yahweh. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, so I digress. Some other attributes which more or less describe what God does include attributes such as merciful, kind, punishing, retributive, providing, sustaining, loving, guiding, and so many others. All these attributes are likewise limited in the scope that they depend on other factors. For example, God is merciful in so much as there is something to be merciful to. Without there being something to be merciful to, or to be retributive to, or to provide for, or sustain, or to guide, God is not those things. He is capable of those things in his essence, that's for certain, as he is Al-Qadir or Al-Qadir. But those things have not come into effect as of then. So what is core to God is the fact that God is that which is capable of love, capable of retribution, capable of kindness, capable of mercy, capable of providing, capable of sustaining, and capable of creating and guiding, as well as many other attributes. Many of the attributes about what God does, as well as his role, fall under this core attribute to his nature or essence, namely that of the capable or the able-bodied, meaning Al-Qadir or Al-Qadir. Hence, when the Quran makes the statement, God is over all things capable, Wallahu ala kulli shay'in qadir, this would imply that he is first and foremost capable of what is being described in the verse, and secondly, that God is capable of a host of other things such as creating, initiating, originating, expanding, restricting, debasing, hearing, seeing, knowing, and so many others. And speaking of seeing, hearing, and knowing, let us spend a few minutes on these attributes. What does it mean when we say, or when the Quran says that God is seeing, knowing, and hearing? Does this mean that God possesses certain body parts that enable him to see, hear, and know, such as ears, eyes, and a mind or brain? Well, we have already explained that God is indivisible, so he cannot possess parts, as that would be a contradiction. He cannot be broken down into parts and yet at the same time be indivisible. When the Quran says that God is hearing, knowing, and seeing, this speaks of him being capable of being with us at all times wherever we are, and as such, he is acquainted with whatever we are doing, meaning that his presence is with us wherever we are. And this sometimes is personified in certain anthropomorphic descriptions, such as his eyes or his hands. All these are mere anthropomorphic descriptions, and they do not speak to what God is at his core. They are merely used as a way for us to personify God in our minds, though knowing that God is not that way. As he tells us, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, that there is nothing that is like him. So, God uses words such as hears, sees, knows, meaning that God is in tune with everything in the universe. His presence stretches across the fabric of space and time, hence he is with us wherever we are, metaphorically watching, hearing, and seeing. So, to sum up this entire video, what is Allah, or what is God? God is that without which existence cannot exist, that which is uniquely indivisible and irreducible, the indestructible, unaffectable source of dependence for everything, that which cannot reproduce and which cannot be produced, the source and finality of all things, eminent and yet evident, capable in all of its essence, and to which nothing can be equaled or equated. That is God, whom we refer to by the term Allah. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next video. Remember to subscribe to the channel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.